Policy Institute. My name is Thea Lee. I'm president of the Economic Policy Institute, and I want to welcome you to today's event, the labor market impact of the proposed Sprint-T-Mobile merger, which we are co-hosting with our good friends at the Roosevelt Institute. And I wanted to thank Felicia Wong for working with us today, even though she couldn't be here and join us today. So, federal and state antitrust enforcers are currently reviewing the proposed merger of Sprint and T-Mobile, which would cut the number of national players in the U.S. wireless industry from 4 to 3. In the past, antitrust authorities have focused their attention on these kinds of mergers exclusively on the impact on competition in consumer markets. The paper that Roosevelt Institute economist Marshall Steinbaum will present today argues that the merger will also have large negative effects on competition in labor markets, and that antitrust authorities should take these negative effects into account when they conduct reviews of proposed mergers. For more than 3 decades, EPI has been dedicated to promoting the interests of working Americans and their families, with a strong emphasis on the need for policies that help to build worker power. We are excited to be able to help promote the kind of innovative strategies for promoting workers' interests that we're going to be discussing today. As Adil and Marshall argue in their paper, we need much better antitrust enforcement and merger review that includes review of the labor market implications of mergers. But I would also note, as the authors do, that these policies alone are not sufficient to mitigate the ill effects of employer concentration. A theme that runs through the recent research in this area is the idea that collective bargaining can act as an important countervailing force against concentrated corporate power in labor markets. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We're going to start with economist Marshall Steinbaum, who is research director and fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. And Marshall will present the main findings and policy implications of his research with his Roosevelt colleague, Adil Abdella, who is also here today. And the paper is available for those of you who haven't seen it out front. After Marshall finishes his presentation, attorney Maurice Stuckey, who is of counsel at the Concurrence Group and a professor of law at the University of Tennessee, will comment on the legal implications of Adil and Marshall's findings. Unfortunately, Marshall's plane was canceled, so he's not able to be here in person, but he will join us by video. And then EPI's policy director economist Heidi Shierholz will speak to some of the key economic implications of the research. And the final speaker today will be Vanessa Villalta, a T-Mobile United CWA activist and a worker who will be directly affected by the proposed merger. After the speakers have finished, we will have time for questions and answers. We also have a hashtag for those of you who are live tweeting today's events. It is hashtag MonopsonyInMobile, which some of you know is kind of hilarious because of monopsony in motion. But in any case, go ahead, tweet it, because there's going to be some awesome stuff today. And without further ado, welcome Marshall Steinbaum.
Great. Thanks, Thea, and thanks to EPI for putting together this project. It's certainly a great opportunity to kind of work on the implications of some groundbreaking research in labor economics that has, in my view, real policy implications. All right, so this paper is called Labor Market Impact of the Sprint-T-Mobile Merger. It's joint work with Adil Abdella, who's here, and we'll get started. So the Sprint-T-Mobile merger is currently being reviewed by federal and state antitrust regulators and sector-specific regulators in communications, and the general tenor of this discussion is whether it was threatening to competition for us to have only 3 wireless telecoms providers in this country as opposed to currently 4. This sector is already highly concentrated. We know that there's already service issues in telecoms, and I think there are very few people who think, yeah, my wireless contract really great. I feel like I'm getting what I paid for, perfect service. Yeah, totally happy with the way everything's going. So there's good reason to be concerned about yet further concentration in this area. Speaking more nerdily, there's horizontal merger models that are kind of standard issue in this field, where you kind of plug in some key parameters regarding the merger and the firms that are merging and say, well, what will be the impact on consumers on prices paid for wireless contracts? And those show that indeed this merger will, according to those models, cause prices for wireless contracts to go up. Moreover, in horizontal merger enforcement, there's something called a structural presumption that dates to key Supreme Court cases that strengthen this country's antitrust enforcement that say, we can just kind of conclude from the fact that it is a 4-3 merger in a concentrated industry that this merger would violate the Clayton Act. So there's already very good reason to be concerned about the legality of this merger and whether it should be approved by federal and state regulators. What we bring to the table is to supplement that debate with the discussion of labor markets. And to do that, we use some new research that's recently gotten a lot of attention regarding the effect of concentration in labor markets on workers' earnings, and showing that, in fact, concentration in labor markets is widespread in the U.S. economy, by depending on how you define labor markets, most, in some cases the vast majority of labor markets in the U.S. economy are highly concentrated. I want to kind of step back from the literature on concentration, though, because one thing that I think it's important to emphasize is that the idea of monopsony, that is to say employer power in labor markets, arise, and deviations from perfect competition in economics lingo arise from more than just concentration of employers in those markets. I would say the key indicators of labor market monopsony are that labor supply is inelastic to the individual firm, meaning if employers reduce wages, they're not likely to lose that many employees, or employees are not too likely to leave. Switching the point of view from the worker's perspective, what they earn in wages is less than what they're worth, in economics lingo, the marginal product of labor. This is something that EPI has been tracking for a long time now, this famous diagram of the deviation of wages from productivity in the economy. And I personally interpret that very diagram as evidence of rising monopsony power in the U.S. economy. So what causes monopsony power, employer power to set wages? Concentration is certainly one such cause. If you feel like you're getting paid less than what you're worth, you can't go and get paid what you're worth by an alternative employer because there aren't any. And so that's kind of the canonical case of monopsony. That's what the word literally means. But it's not the only way in which employer power to set wages can arise. We know from copious labor market research that discrimination and market segmentation are rampant. So even if for an outside observer, you might think, okay, well, there's a bunch of different firms hiring in this labor market or hiring people that look like the people whose wages are low. But in reality, there's not really any alternative employers because those employers are discriminatory, because the market is more segmented, because people are sort of slotted into a position and they can't really just go out and get an outside job offer. Again, this is a deviation from received wisdom in economics, where if you're not getting paid what you're worth, you can just go get another job offer, find somebody else to pay you, and that just isn't the case. The book to which Thea just alluded, Monopsony in Motion, is a kind of model of rampant monopsony power through search frictions, through the inability to reallocate labor across the labor market, even where it looks like there are many employers, that you don't have the canonical concentration in the labor market, but you still have employer power to set wages. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that that's the overall environment that we're working in. I like this phrase, labor is people and people can be exploited. This is historically why labor economists have seen their own subfield as being different fundamentally from what the rest of economics is about, that there's something about labor markets that are that just means they don't work like the canonical competitive market in economics. Now, whether any market looks like that is a different question, but I think we can be very confident that labor markets don't. And again, this gets to what Thea also alluded to, that there's scope for countervailing power in labor markets, just sort of by their nature of the exploitative possibilities that exist within them. And I would say, moreover, that's why, as much as I'm going to talk about antitrust policy and what that has to say, antitrust alone will never kind of be a solution to the structural imbalance of power that exists within labor markets. If labor markets are monopsonized, as a matter of course, if employers do have market power, then that makes it incumbent on antitrust enforcers to consider labor markets as well as product markets in all of their enforcement activities, and specifically in merger review. Because if employers have market power, then we would expect that profit maximizing firms would use that power to reduce wages. And when there's a merger, that kind of by definition increases the market power of employers, and thus we would expect them to use that increased market power to make life worse for their workers and for workers in the labor markets where they hire. That suggests a kind of across-the-board departure from received wisdom in antitrust, where the sine qua non has been consumer welfare and, in terms of actual economic observables, prices for consumers as being decisive over whether, given a merger or certain conduct that the antitrust enforcers are examining, whether that is illegal. It is illegal if it harms consumers. The way we know if it harms consumers is that it raises prices for them. That whole sort of chain of reasoning breaks down, or at least needs to be supplemented, if labor markets are monopsonized as a matter of course. And this is what I would say is a broad matter we're encouraging antitrust regulators to do. So what we're going to do in this paper is take a bunch of recent estimates that exist in the economics literature about the effect of concentration on earnings and apply those estimates to the markets that are affected by this merger. So we calculate tabulate employment in those markets and then calculate concentration of employment using data that was constructed or gathered by Change to Win. From that data on employment in individual labor markets, we can calculate concentration, and then by combining the market shares of the merging parties, Sprint and T-Mobile, we can generate a prediction for the change in concentration that will result from this merger. Anytime you calculate concentration in an antitrust context, it is kind of, I should say, you first have to decide what the right market definition is. This idea of market definition is extremely important in antitrust, and so the question is, well, I mean, there's lots of principles that could potentially guide what do we look at when we try to define a market. There's Supreme Court rulings that say, well, there's two elements to market definition. One is a geographic market, and the other is a line of business. So you have to sort of choose both dimensions when you define a labor market. What we've done in this paper is take the employment in all of the retail stores owned by the merging parties, their competitors AT&T and Verizon, and including their authorized dealers and their prepaid affiliates. So that is the line of business. That is retail wireless services and retail wireless services. And then the geographic definition is what's called a commuting zone. This is a kind of delineation of the United States into geographic areas that are defined by commuting patterns of people to other places in those areas. So the idea is that it may be that some people commute across the border of a commuting zone, but most people will commute within the geographic boundaries of their commuting zone. The papers that we rely on to generate the estimates that we use, none of them have exactly the same market definition as that market definition, but the specifications that we've drawn from each of the papers are what we think is the most comparable market definition, and therefore the most comparable estimate of the effect of market concentration on earnings that come from each of those studies. So if you look at this equation that I've put up on the screen here, the HHI, Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, is a measure of concentration in labor markets that we're getting from the Change to Win data. The beta hat is the effect of changes in earnings or changes in concentration on earnings. The beta hats come from these 4 economics papers that estimate the effect of concentration on earnings. And then the left-hand side of this equation is what we're estimating with this whole exercise. That is the change in earnings that will be the result of the change in concentration arising from this merger. We have 3 papers, and from those 3 papers, we're taking a total of 4 estimates of the beta, and we're going to see, well, here we'll see first the right-hand side. This is the change in concentration, the change in HHI that will result from combining Sprint and T-Mobile within the wireless retail markets that I just described. This is, you can't see the names of the commuting zones, but this is by commuting zone in the US economy. And the legend, which may also be a little bit hard to see given that it's small, basically tracks the change in concentration that the federal antitrust agency's horizontal merger guidelines point to as a driving concern, enforcement concern in merger review. So if the federal horizontal merger guidelines, that is to say the sort of broad economy-wide notification from the agencies to the business community, what do the agencies look for and review for when about whether a merger might trigger enforcement concerns, they'll say, well, if the concentration in the relevant antitrust markets increases by more than 200, that would be a cause for concern. And here what we see, all of the red commuting zones in this map have a change in concentration that's more than 200 HHI points. All of the green areas are the areas that are not affected by the merger, according to our methodology, because they don't have employment by one or both of the two merging firms. So what this map tells you is basically wherever both of these two firms are active, almost in all of those places that would trigger enforcement concerns, because in almost all of those places, the change in concentration is more than 200 HHI points. I have another map in the paper, which I didn't put in this presentation, that shows the ex post concentration in all of these labor markets after the merger. And it shows that if this merger were to be approved, according to our predictions, literally every market in the country defined in this way would have an HHI above 2,500 HHI points, and that is also a trigger for enforcement action according to the federal horizontal merger guidelines. So again, this is what you see in this map is what goes in the right-hand side of that equation. This is what comes out on the left-hand side, given each of the different estimates of beta hat that we take from these papers. These are histograms that show number of commuting zones on the y-axis. And for each of the specifications, what you're seeing on the x-axis is the percent change in earnings that's predicted as a result of this change in concentration. So again, we get the change in concentration market by market from the change to win data. That translates into a percent change in earnings using the point estimates, the coefficient estimates that come from the four papers that we use. Yes. I think these mobile phone contracts are generally not sold online. I think there is only a brick and mortar employment. That's not true? Okay. Well, no. So this is brick and mortar retail employment. Yes. So these estimates are different depending on which specification you're drawing from. I would say, though, by economic standards, they're actually pretty similar in the sense that all of the papers that have studied this issue, and of which I have not drawn on all of them to write this paper, they all find negative effects of concentration on employment. They all have kind of specifications beyond the ones that we use here that find that effect is robust to including lots of other controls that might also impact wages, or that might be sort of omitted variables that explain both concentration and wages. So I didn't include those because, in some sense, they're more robust estimates of the effect of concentration on wages, but they're not comparable market definitions to what we have from the change to win data. I should also say that according to the law, basically any negative effect on competition is considered to make a merger violate the Clayton Act. So here you can see this distributed in the maps. The first two specifications are both from the paper by Azar Marinescu and myself. We take two specifications from that paper because they're two sort of different methodologies for estimating these effects, and the instrumental variables methodology, which is supposed to be better at ascertaining exogenous variation in concentration, actually finds the larger magnitude of the effect of concentration on earnings. If you can't see the legend here, the red is a change in weekly earnings that's greater than $10, or decline in weekly earnings that's greater than $10. And orange is between 5 and 10, and yellow is greater than 0 but less than $5. Yes, the IV is the bottom map. Yep, that's correct. And these two maps come from the other two specifications, Ben Melech, Bergman, and Kim, and Kevin Rins. So basically the point estimate in those specifications is what drives the variation between these four estimates. The change in concentration is the same, since that's just coming straight from the change to win data, that's the same for all four of these specifications. All right, so to conclude, antitrust enforcers have to take competitive effects in labor markets into account as a matter of course. This is something that they themselves have agreed to, at least publicly. They say that if there's a decline in competition in labor markets, it's just as illegal under the Clayton Act as a decline in competition in product markets. But there's precious little evidence of them actually doing it. So the whole kind of motivation for this paper is not just to speak to predict the effect of this merger, Sprint and T-Mobile, but also to provide a model to the enforcement agencies as to how they could incorporate labor markets into merger review, given that they themselves have said that they should be doing that and they currently aren't. What part of the reason they've said they currently aren't is because they lack the data to evaluate the effect of mergers in labor markets. So I would encourage them to acquire that data, and one way they could do so is through the Hart-Scott-Rodino process. So there's a process. It used to be in this that mergers were just as illegal, but they would basically be found to be illegal after they'd already occurred, and that was deemed to be an inefficient way of enforcing the law. So now there's a process whereby a merger cannot be consummated unless it goes through this process, and the process includes surrendering proprietary data to the enforcers so that they can investigate the effect of the merger ex ante and say, well, challenge it or not challenge it. And that process should be made to include labor market data. There's no reason why it couldn't if they're also of the opinion that reductions in competition in labor markets are potentially illegal under the Clayton Act. And that should be comprehensive. It should include job histories, since in many cases employers do have data on those things, and it should include whether they employ restraints like non-compete clauses of their workers. I would also say it should include demographics, since, as I was alluding to before, monopsony power often takes a form of discrimination and market segmentation. Their sort of more general research on labor supply elasticity to the individual firm suggests that that is very low, that in response to a reduction in wages, most workers will not leave, or the wage reduction would have to be very large in order to make people leave. The chairman of the FTC himself said that that is the principle that should guide how labor markets would be defined for antitrust purposes. And if that's true, then labor markets are small for antitrust purposes, which means that most employers would likely have market power under the law in labor markets. That's quite significant for the possibility of enforcing the antitrust laws against employer power in labor markets. Just last week, the chairman of the FTC said in congressional testimony, he was asked about non-compete clauses and whether the agency would take action against them, and he said there's lots of he was saying, well, yes, we could, but there's lots of circumstances where the company that's imposing the non-compete doesn't have market power. I think that that's a nonsense statement as far as economics goes. If you're imposing a contractual restraint on workers without compensation, that is an exercise in market power. What he means there is that the antitrust law only recognizes a very small definition of market power, that is to say concentration in a well-defined antitrust market. I was just talking about how how antitrust market should be narrowly defined according to his own principles, but I have also proposed with Maurice Stuckey, who's also here today in spirit, that definition of market power should be defined more expansively, including to include something like the ability to impose contractual restraints without compensation as being itself evidence of market power. So I would say, as an economist, the statement that there's circumstances where a company imposes a non-compete that doesn't have market power, that's nonsense, and that should be made in the law that's nonsense. Thank you very much. Look forward to a discussion.
Thank you so much, Marshall. I think that was an excellent set of research and an excellent presentation. I probably taxed a few people's back to your Econ 301 days and grad school days, but this is such an important issue, and it's important research, and we are looking forward to hearing from Maurice Stuckey next, Attorney Maurice Stuckey, because this is actually an economic argument that could very well have a lot of implications for how lawyers look at antitrust cases going forward, both with respect to mergers and so on. And I see that Maurice has joined us virtually. So Maurice, thank you so much. I'm sorry you couldn't be here with us in person, but we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Will actually leave Knoxville, so I apologize not being there. So what I'd like to do is will actually
put
leave
Marshall
Knoxville.
and Adil's paper in
I apologize not being there.
context
So what
with
I'd like to
4
do
points. So first I want to look
is
at the market power
put
problem
Marshall
currently
and
in the
Adil's
US, just how
paper in
broad it is.
context.
Second,
with 4
look at
points.
one key
so first I want to
policy
look
tool
at
to address the
market power problem
currently, namely
in the US,
antitrust
just
merger
how
review.
broad it is.
Third, to
Second,
discuss
look
a
at
major
one key
blind spot
policy tool
in
to address the
merger review,
power
namely
problem,
its
namely
preoccupation
antitrust
with
merger
the
review.
merger's likely
Third,
effects
to discuss
downstream,
a
as
major
Marshall
blind
pointed out,
spot
and its inattention
merger
to
review,
the likely
namely its
competitive effects
preoccupation
upstream,
with the
which
merger's
could
likely
include
effects downstream, as
sellers
Marshall
and
pointed out.
workers.
And its
And then finally, to
inattention
bring this home,
to
then
the
with
likely
the
competitive
Sprint
effects
T-Mobile
upstream,
merger,
which
so
could include
the first thing is
sellers
that there's
and workers.
growing evidence
And then
of a
finally,
market
to
power
bring this
problem
home then
in the U.S.
with
over the
the
past
Sprint
35
T-Mobile
years. So,
merger.
as Marshall pointed out,
the first thing
many
is that
U.S.
there's
industries are now
growing
becoming
evidence of a market power
increasingly
problem
more concentrated.
in the U.S. over the past
Profit
35
margins
years.
are
So,
widening.
as Marshall pointed
with a
out,
few firms
many
with
U.S.
significant
industries are now
share.
becoming
The innovation
more
levels are also
concentrated.
suboptimal. We
Profit
did a recent
margins are
paper,
widening
for the
with a
European
few
Commission.
firms reaping
And what we
significant
found
share.
from the recent
The
economic
innovation levels
studies
are also
is that there's
suboptimal. We did a
declining
recent,
competition
paper,
is
for the
partly
European Commission.
responsible for a
And
lower
what we
rate
found
of
from the
investment
recent
in
economic
US
studies
innovation.
is that there's
There's
declining
also been a slowdown
competition
in the creation
is
of new
partly
businesses.
responsible
As
for a
Marshall
lower
pointed
rate
out,
of
the U.S. labor
investment in
markets have
US
become less
innovation.
fluid, with
There's
workers
also
less
been a
likely to
slowdown
move
in the
between
creation of
jobs,
new businesses.
industries, occupations,
As
and
Marshall
locations.
pointed out, the U.S. labor
And
markets have become less
another
fluid,
disturbing
with
sign
workers
in the
less
U.S.
likely
is
to
how
move
the share of
between
income
jobs,
going to
industries,
capital has
occupations, and
risen, and the
locations.
share of income going to labor
And
has fallen.
Another
And the
disturbing
EPI,
sign in the
among
U.S.
others,
is how
has
the share of
chronicled
income
these
going to
trends,
capital has risen,
along with the
and the share
growing
of
income and
going
wealth
to labor
inequality.
has fallen.
So
And
the
the
mounting
EPI,
evidence all
among
points
others,
to
has
this
chronicled these trends,
less
along with the
competition,
growing income and
greater
wealth
profits
inequality.
falling fewer
So the
hands.
mounting evidence all
And
points to
traditionally, one
this,
important policy tool to
less
prevent the market
competition,
power
greater
problem
profits falling
was
fewer
antitrust. So
And
historically,
traditionally,
antitrust
one
was meant to
important
prevent
policy
one
tool
firm
to
or a
prevent the
handful of
market
firms from
power
acquiring
problem
significant market
was
power.
antitrust.
And
So historically,
important
antitrust was meant to
because
prevent one firm
the belief
or a
was
handful
that
of firms
economic
from
power
acquiring
often
significant market
translated
power.
to political
And
power.
This
So
is
the
important
impact wasn't
because
just merely
the
on
belief
our
was
wallets.
that
It was also
economic
on
power
our autonomy,
often translated
on our
to
well-being,
political
and
power.
on our democracy.
So the impact
And
wasn't
one way
just
to address
merely on
the
our
market
wallets.
power
It was
problem
also on
was
our
through merger
autonomy,
review.
on
And
our
Congress
well-being,
amended
and on our democracy.
Section 7 of the Clayton Act.
And
that's
one
the
way to address
primary,
the
statute
market
to deal
power
with
problem
mergers
was through
in
merger review.
1950.
And Congress
And
amended,
as the court
Section
said, the
7 of the
dominant
Clayton
theme
Act,
for its debating
primary,
congressional
statute to
consideration
deal
of the
with
1950
mergers
amendments
in 1950
was a fear of the rising
And
tide of
as the
economic
court said, the dominant
concentration in the
theme for
American economy.
debating congressional
And to
consideration
arrest
of the
this rising
1950
tide towards
amendments
concentration
was a
into
fear
too
of the
few
rising
hands,
tide of economic
Congress decided to
concentration
clamp
in the
down with
American
vigor
economy.
on
And
mergers.
to arrest this
So
rising
here,
tide towards
the goal was
concentration
to
into
preserve
too few hands,
competition among many
Congress
small
decided
businesses
to clamp
by
down with
arresting
vigor
a trend
on
towards
mergers.
concentration in
So
its
here,
incipiency.
the goal was to preserve
Before
competition
that
among many small
trend developed to
businesses
the point
by
that the market
arresting a
was left in
trend
the grip of
towards
a few big
concentration in
companies.
its
And
incipiency.
Section 7 was meant to
Before
arrest
that
this
trend
trend
developed
both
to
in
the point that
downstream
the market was
markets
left
as
in the
well
grip
as
of a few
upstream markets.
companies. And Section
what
7
happened?
was meant
Well,
to
for
arrest
a few
this trend,
decades, we
both
actually
in
had
downstream
robust
markets as well
merger
as
review.
upstream markets.
But we also
So what
had
happened?
other important
Well,
safeguards,
for
like
a few
powerful
decades,
unions
we
and
actually
collective
had
bargaining.
robust
But then that
merger
changed
review.
in 1980.
But
The
we
incoming
also had
Reagan
other
administration
important safeguards,
adopted the
like
more
powerful
laissez-faire
unions
beliefs
and
of the
collective
then
bargaining.
Chicago
But
School.
then that changed in
The FTC and the
1980. The
DOJ
incoming
allowed
Reagan
mergers in
administration
more highly
adopted
concentrated
the more
industries,
laissez-faire beliefs
and the
of
focus was
then Chicago
primarily
School.
downstream
The
and
FTC
primarily
the
on
DOJ
prices that
allowed
consumers
mergers
paid.
in more highly concentrated
And
industries.
even on this dimension,
and the focus
it seems
was
that the DOJ and
primarily
the FTC
downstream
got it wrong.
and primarily on prices that
John
consumers
Kowalko of
paid.
Northeastern
And
has done
even
some
on this
research
dimension,
looking at
it
all
seems
the
that
available
DOJ and
post-merger
the
reviews.
FTC got it
And
wrong.
what he found was
John
that
Kowalko of
75%
has done
of
some
these
research looking at
post-merger
all the
reviews
available post-merger
was a
reviews.
price increase.
And what he found was
So to
that
compound the problem,
75%
the
of
enforcers
these, post-merger reviews
got it wrong,
was a
often
price
got it wrong
increase.
downstream. So and they never really
problem,
looked upstream on
enforcers
sellers and workers, and this was a blind spot. So let me give you this example because I really think it brings it to the fore.
And they never really looked upstream.
In 2015,
on
Westinghouse
sellers and workers
announced its acquisition of Faiveley Transport. Now, these were two of the three largest railroad equipment suppliers in the U.S. And the DOJ opened an investigation. For 1 year, it studied this merger. It eventually entered into a consent decree where Faiveley had to divest its U.S. freight car brake business to a third party. But the DOJ only looked at the downstream effects that this merger might have. Like, what impact would it have on customers? It never really considered how this merger might affect workers upstream. And if they had only turned their gaze upstream, what they would have found was that at that time, Westinghouse, Faiveley, and Knorr-Bremse were illegally agreeing to not poach each other's employees. So they were basically engaging in a hardcore cartel. They were agreeing not to recruit, solicit, hire, or otherwise compete for each other's employees. So not only is this per se illegal, it also shows that the merger was likely to be anti-competitive for these labor markets upstream. Typically, what the agencies do, and when I was at DOJ as well, is we want to see is the industry susceptible to collusion? And evidence that the industry is susceptible to collusion is if the parties had previously colluded. Here, they were actively colluding in this industry. So while the DOJ was investigating this merger, the parties were actually colluding. And these were the senior executives. And they were being deposed by the DOJ. Now, you might think this is really brazen, but it's actually perfectly rational because the executives had very little to fear. That the DOJ and the FTC are preoccupied with the downstream effects, and they never really looked upstream. So here, they cleared the merger in 2016. Because the DOJ did not look up, the companies continued colluding until the DOJ challenged this behavior 2 years later in 2018. So my important point here is that in order to get the merger review right, you have to look at both the upstream and the downstream effects. And another key point that Marshall brought out, and this was also an important paper by another economist, Glick, that Marshall cites, is that by not looking upstream, you can actually get it wrong twice. You can now consider as an efficiency reduction in wages, which might actually be the exercise of market power. So that's really problematic because now you're crediting to the parties a merger-specific efficiency, which is actually anti-competitive behavior. So it's not just bad news. We've got some good news as well. The good news is now the DOJ and the FTC, in recent congressional testimony, have promised to look upstream. The head of the antitrust division said recently that the traditional Philadelphia National Bank presumption that Marshall identified, as well as the HHI concentration levels that Marshall and Adil calculated, can be used to predict anti-competitive effects upstream. Basically, if it exceeds the thresholds, then the merger is presumptively anti-competitive. And the FTC chair testified that his agency will assess a proposed transaction's potential effects on the labor market. So my last minute, let me just talk quickly about Sprint and T-Mobile. This is a merger that's ripe for the analysis that Marshall and Adil did. Because here you have a concentrated industry, 4 major operators nationwide. Many of these retail labor markets are already highly concentrated and will become significantly more concentrated as a result of this transaction. The merger is presumptively anti-competitive, both upstream and downstream, under the HHI thresholds, as well as Philadelphia National Bank. And this appears to be also the first attempt by Marshall and Adil to examine how the magnitude of the harm. although the Clayton Act doesn't require it, they go an extra step and they predict what the likely impact this would have on wages. So this is a timely study for an important merger that's going to have broad ramifications in our economy. And it's really important that the agencies look upstream, and I think that this study will help them do so. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maurice, for that legal context and a little bit of history as well. And we're delighted that you were able to join us even remotely. It worked really nicely for a change. And next, we're delighted to have EPI's own Policy Director, Heidi Shierholz, with the economic implications.
Thank you, Thea. I appreciate it. And thank you, Marshall and Adil, for the fantastic work you're doing. I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of this panel. So this work adds to the recent extremely exciting new research in labor economics that emphasizes that employer power in, wait, I'm getting lots of signals. Is that, okay. Thank you. Okay, it adds to this exciting literature that shows that employer concentration in labor markets can have a significant negative impact on workers' wages. And in particular, this paper adds to that literature by showing how those wage effects might play out on the ground in the event of this proposed merger between Sprint and T-Mobile, and by modeling how antitrust enforcers could start taking into account the labor impacts of proposed mergers when they are deciding whether or not to approve them in the future. So Marshall went over the results, but I'm just going to state a couple of the key ones again for just to bring home the take-home messages. So they find that earnings in the retail wireless services sector broadly in the 50 most affected labor markets nationwide would decline by somewhere between $10 per week and $63 per week on average. For a full-year worker, this translates into an annual loss of somewhere between $520 and $3,276, and it goes without saying that these are meaningful amounts to the working people in these jobs. And I just want to emphasize that the fact that this effect is not just for workers in Sprint and T-Mobile. This effect is for workers in the entire retail wireless services sector in each of these labor markets. And to understand why that is, it's useful to sort of think of the logic behind it. The key way that non-unionized workers can secure decent wages is when their employer knows that they could quit their job and get a decent job at a competitor. When the number of firms is reduced because a merger happens, that means that even if your firm was not involved in the merger, the number of firms, the number of competitors that you could work at just went down. That means the threat that you could quit your job and get a decent job somewhere else also just went down. So the merger would reduce the leverage of workers in the entire sector, not just not just of the workers of those two firms. So that means that Verizon wireless workers, AT&T mobility workers will be negatively affected right alongside Sprint and T-Mobile workers. And it's worth noting that AT&T mobility workers are unionized, and I'm going to talk about that impact in a minute, but it's worth noting that the fact that they're unionized would certainly help mitigate the wage losses for those workers. But of course, the next time contract negotiations come around, the reduced prevailing wage in the sector will really hamper their bargaining position. So it will have this long-term effect even on unionized workers in the sector. Okay, another key point I want to make is just how important the literature that this paper is a part of really is, and I would just like to apologize to all of my EPI colleagues who have already heard my shtick about why I love this literature so much. I'm going to tell it again. And the thing about this literature is that this work, the work that Marshall has done in this paper and other work that Marshall and colleagues have done, it identifies one way employer power and labor market can have a significant negative impact on wages. It's enormously important for many reasons, but one of the reasons is what it is a departure from. It's a departure from the idea of perfect competition, and Marshall got into this a little bit, and I'm going to say a few more words. So perfect competition is the model that underlies most economists' thinking about the way most of the labor market works. And to give you an idea of just what that means, it's worth talking about what the assumptions are that underlie this model. So the key one is that workers are paid their marginal product, and that's essentially what the value of your worth is, what the value of your work is to the firm. And Marshall was doing this too. I'm going to use the word worth in this context, and we're just using it as shorthand to get at this impossible to measure, but sort of standard concept in economics about essentially the value of your work to the firm. So a key assumption of perfect competition is that employers don't have the power to pay workers less than what they're worth. They don't have the power to pay workers less and then keep some of the fruits of workers' labor for themselves. So that's the main one. Then the other assumptions related to that are workers, if they are paid less than what they're worth, they can instantaneously find another job where they are paid fairly, and then the employer that had the audacity to pay them less than what they're worth, if they don't start paying their workers fairly, they will instantaneously go out of business. So those are the assumptions that underlie perfect competition. And I want to just say two things about that. I don't think any economist likely believes that this is literally true. But what I also believe is that most economists actually believe that that is a tolerable enough approximation to the labor market that they're totally fine having those assumptions underlie the way they think about most of the labor market. And you see it popping up all the time. So think about minimum wage debates. It's the one, maybe it's an easier one for everyone to sort of wrap their brain around. We know that every time the idea of raising the minimum wage comes up, people trot out these Econ 101 models that say if you raise the minimum wage, that's going to cause job loss. What is important for us all to know is that the things underlying the model that gets that result, that if you raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause job loss, are the assumptions of perfect competition. Like that results from the fact that the assumption that workers are paid exactly what they're worth, that employers are not able to pay them any less than what they're worth and keep some of the fruits of their labor for themselves. If you relax that assumption and instead allow for the possibility that employers may actually be able to pay workers less than what they are worth, then the model doesn't predict that you'll see job loss if you raise the minimum wage. And we all know that the empirical studies that come out have shown exactly that the wage increases that we have seen have not caused job loss, pointing more to the fact that these ideas of perfect competition, they're just not accurately reflecting the labor market. So the work that Marshall and his colleagues are doing that shows that employers have the power to suppress wages is extremely important in getting the economics field to grapple with this idea that maybe, just maybe, perfect competition isn't a good way to characterize most labor markets. And then I said I was going to talk about this. I want to just mention one thing that's important to note around this is that traditionally, economists, with their models of perfect competition, have been totally complicit in providing justification for the idea that anything that does provide workers' power, like minimum wage increases, like boosting unionization, that those types of things will cause job loss. They will hamper growth. They will reduce efficiency in the labor market. And one really important thing that's coming out of this round of literature is that are the findings around unionization, and in particular the finding that the wage suppressing effects of concentration are actually less when workers are unionized. That is not surprising, I am sure, to anyone in this room. When we are not in a perfectly competitive world, which we know we are not, and employers have the power to set wages below what people are worth, then things that boost workers' wages, things like strong labor standards, things like unions, actually increase efficiency in the labor market. And both Marshall and Maurice made this point that that is very relevant to antitrust policy because traditionally, and in the antitrust setting, it was only the suppression of input wages. And the suppression of input prices, including lower wages, has simply been seen as efficiency enhancing because it reduces the price to consumers. But when you let go of the idea that labor markets are perfectly competitive, we know that lower wages lead to fewer workers and lower output, which reduces efficiency. So as Marshall points out, the antitrust enforcers who review proposed mergers need to start taking that into account in a real way. And I know my time is waning, and the last point I just want to make is that this whole discussion helps us understand what has been at the heart of rising inequality and largely stagnant wages for most workers in recent decades. We know that far from being perfectly competitive, where neither employers nor workers, for that matter, have the power to set wages, most labor markets are better characterized by sort of a tug of war between employers and workers for who gets what share of the growth in the American economy. Employers inherently have power, and policies like policies to support unions, policies to support labor standards and their enforcement, used to provide strong countervailing power to workers so that there was more balance in the labor market. As those things have been decimated through deliberate policy choices, worker power has collapsed, increasing employers' relative power dramatically and leading to the rise of inequality and stagnant wages for most workers. And so all of this provides a really clear roadmap for what to do to reverse the trends. So Marshall and his colleagues are pushing a really important way to fight wage suppression through antitrust. It's incredibly valuable. And alongside that, we just need to continue to fight to restore and enact policies that provide workers countervailing power, like maintaining full employment, like labor standards and their enforcement, and like policies to boost unionization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi, the inimitable Heidi Shierholz. And I want to say, even having heard that less than a week ago, it just gets better with time and with repetition. So I'm not bored, and I'm sure nobody else is either. And our last speaker, we're delighted to have with us Vanessa Villalta. We wanted to have the voice of an actual CWA T-Mobile worker with us today, and I think Vanessa is going to provide some really interesting context for this very technical discussion. So thank you and welcome, Vanessa.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Vanessa Villalta. I am a mobile expert, also known as a retail sales representative at a T-Mobile store in Houston, Texas. I have worked as a retail sales rep for T-Mobile for the past 5 years, first in a mid-volume store and now in a high-volume store. I am a proud member of T-Mobile Workers United, CWA. T-Mobile Workers United is an organization of T-Mobile and Metro employees joining together for a voice and a fair treatment at T-Mobile and Metro. We are hundreds of call center reps, retail associates, and technicians, and we have come together as TU to support each other and work towards positive change at T-Mobile, USA, and Metro. Unfortunately, as a member of TU, I do not have the protection of a union contract at work. T-Mobile has fought our attempts to organize as a union and win collective bargaining rights on the job. It is my understanding that T-Mobile has more labor law violations per employee than any other company in America, and that includes Walmart. It is ironic because T-Mobile's German parent has a good relationship with its union in Germany, and it is also my understanding that Sprint is an anti-union company. So let's be clear, the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint will bring together two aggressively anti-union companies. In fact, AT&T Mobility is the only unionized wireless company in the United States. I have listened to the economists discuss the ways in which the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint will increase the ability of the merged T-Mobile to depress wages of workers at the new company. As a frontline T-Mobile worker, this makes sense to me. I can tell you from experience that retail wireless workers frequently move from one wireless company to another. If we've had bad managers or sales quotas become unreasonable or they reduce our commissions, we'll often quit work at one wireless store and look for work at another wireless company store. In my own store, there's one sales rep who's come from AT&T and another who's come from Verizon. There's so much turnaround in our stores that this is actually quite common. I would also add that we sign a non-compete for 60 days, and I believe sometimes it's longer for management as well. We think of ourselves as skilled professionals selling wireless equipment and services. This is how we are different from sales representatives selling computers or other electronic equipment. We sell equipment and service plans. Those plans are complicated, change often, and it takes a lot of training to keep up with the changes. We also need to have a really good interpersonal skills because we have to figure out what a customer needs. Is it a family plan? Do they need unlimited data? Can they pass a credit check? Or do I need to focus on a prepaid plan? I can tell you that my coworkers are very worried about our jobs after the merger. We saw a video of T-Mobile CEO John Legere telling senators in a congressional hearing that after the merger, he would rationalize the number of stores cutting jobs. This only makes sense. You can see from the maps. You can see from the maps that Sprint and T-Mobile stores and those of the prepaid brands Metro and Boost are quite close to each other, often on the same street corner. After the merger, the new T-Mobile will close redundant stores, and guess what? I fear that me and many of my coworkers will be redundant as well. This means that we will be out on the street looking for jobs. CWA's research finds that 3,000 of us are likely to lose our jobs after the merger. So that's why CWA says this merger should be blocked unless T-Mobile commits to regulators that it will not lay off employees as a result of the merger and will agree to respect our legal right to have a union on the job. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that was a terrific panel, and we had a lot of different perspectives on there, both economics and legal and from the workers themselves. And we are going to just go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Please wait for a microphone, which will come around to you. Up here, right here in the second to last row. And please state your name and your affiliation if you have one. Thanks. And
yes, thank you very much. I'm Carolyn Byerly from Howard University. I study media mergers in my spare time. But I'm particularly interested in the impact on women and minorities. You didn't break your demographics down. You've looked at workers as a broad category. You also haven't talked about job classifications. Are you able to do any of that?
The answer is not in the specific project that we've done here. The data that we, or at least I have used with my co-authors on job posting that has enabled us to draw our conclusions about earnings, it tells you a lot of information about the job, but not necessarily about the people who would be taking the job. But I agree with you that that is a crucial dimension to examine. There's been excellent research, to my mind, tracing especially the sort of gendered aspect of the labor market to monopsony power on the part of employers, that women systematically have access to fewer job opportunities, that they're more locked into any one particular job, that this gives their employers power to pay differentially. I think one of the best papers that speaks to this question recently looked at firms that had patents granted versus firms that applied for patents but didn't have them granted. So that was the sort of source of variation, was whether you did or didn't have your patent accepted. And it found that when firms have their patents accepted, workers' wages at those firms go up, but only the men's wages go up. Women who worked at those firms experienced no increase in wages. And I think that tells you sort of how the bargaining power is shared out within the firm. And I think that arises in large part because of the difference is in outside options available to workers within the firm. So I think one of the most promising areas, if I could say, be so bold as to say that, in terms of expanding the research agenda on labor market monopsony, is towards trying to explain the gender wage gap and other gendered aspects of the labor market.
Heidi, do you want to?
You know what? I'll just say one thing that has helped me with the intuition of that might be useful for other people. If you just think of employers have sort of monopsony power over you. Anytime you can't instantaneously quit your job and find another job if you aren't being paid fairly. And because of pervasive discrimination in the labor market on the basis of both race and gender, that's just less true for women and minorities, that you could instantaneously find another job where you're paid fairly. And so when we're talking about concentration as a form of monopsony power, that it's just when your outside options are cut, it's just going to have a disproportionate effect on wages and on women and minorities for that reason. But I agree, it's not super well documented, and so it's really ripe area for more research.
If I could just add again, I think this is actually a totally virgin area for antitrust to get into, and that it absolutely should go there, because I would say things like disparate impact on racial and gender minorities of anti-competitive behavior, like concentration, for example, are recognizable in the economy, and they should be recognizable in the law. And I think that that's something that people who are interested in reforming the policy should be kind of putting front and center.
Carolyn, did you want to follow up? Hold on, wait for the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm really stunned at this. I mean, we've had all this legislation passed around job equality and Title VII and so forth and so on. I tried to get a breakdown by gender from Communication Workers of America. They won't even tell you what their union. I mean, what the demographics are within their unions. And I don't know what the holdup is in the research area. I mean, why is this not being done? It's so important. It has everything to do with what's going on right now.
I can only speak to that a very important point in general terms, and that is, as a labor economist, what you're trained. You're certainly trained to view disparities on the basis of race and gender and other dimensions as important to labor market outcomes. But tying those to the power of employers, that is to say, to look at the other that's viewed as a worker characteristic, and that there's a whole research agenda involved in investigating the sources of differential pay and working conditions on the basis of worker characteristics, to sort of go to the other side of the bargain, so to speak, and look at employers and their role in setting the labor market package, so to speak, available to workers. That's kind of a whole different question that labor economists are only just now kind of getting into realizing is a big deal. And I think I guess to look at the bright sides, I mean, definitely the glass half empty is, why haven't you done this in decades of supposedly researching these issues, given how important they are. On the other hand, the glass half full is, these are people who have developed very finely tuned tools for detecting causality in the economy and in labor markets in particular, and the idea that they would take those very finely tuned tools and look at employer power, look at the other side of the table, so to speak, look at the concentration of corporate power kind of across dimensions in the U.S. economy. I think that portends very positive developments, intellectually speaking, and hopefully for policy as well.
Okay, let's move on. One in the back there. And you can see that Maurice is joining us for the Q&A. I'm going to actually summarize the questions so that Maurice can hear them, because technology.
Carl Polzer and I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity. It studies inequality and encourages inclusion. So I have a couple things to ask about. One is, I do agree that it's good for the antitrust regulators to check for monopsony power, but I think you might be confusing markets, because there's a market for selling phones and there's a market for labor. In this case, sales is a very large market that goes well beyond this particular trade. I mean, I have friends who sell wooden pallets and they move on to sell advertising, and how much training does it really take? Okay, so I think the relevant market could be very large for labor here. The other assumption that I do agree that perfect competition practically doesn't exist, and if it did in the labor market, the price of labor would tend to go down to the point of getting very little. But I mean, counterfactual to explore would be, under what conditions does labor have the most leverage in this tug of war?
Okay.
Having lots of competitors or just one monopoly? If there's just one monopoly, labor might actually have more leverage, because they could split the rent with the monopolist, and they could have a leverage to shut down the whole system for the whole country, which would give strike a great deal of power. So I'm not sure I buy a couple of the assumptions on this.
Thanks, Carl. And that's a lot there. And let me just summarize for Maurice. That's Carl Polzer. And the first question was that while he agrees that antitrust regulators should check for monopsony, the question is whether the sales market is really much broader than just retail phone, and whether it should be all retail, and how much skill does it need. And I'll let Vanessa take that, as well as Marshall and maybe Maurice. And the second question, I think Marshall and Heidi, if we did have actually a perfectly competitive labor market, would the price of labor go up or down, and how does that fare? So, do you want to start with about the kind of skills, firm-specific skills that are required in your work?
Oh, hello? Okay. As far as skills-wise, I mean, we are selling cell phones, equipment, but I mean, it's also everything that goes into play with how those devices work, along with all the services that we provide, because it's not just cell phones, it's anything from tablets to, other devices that they've, put into play, GPS trackers for cars, how that plays into for business and personal.
How many weeks does it take to come up to speed in training? Knowing nothing is being accomplished?
To be honest with you, it's actually about a month, the least, as far as training in an actual, I guess you can say, classroom setting. And then you still have to go on the floor. And I mean, I would say you learn every day, actually. Every day we go in, there's something new that's on the market, something new that came out. So, I mean, it's not just one specific month. It has to do with a lot.
And Marshall, do you want to talk about how you define the market for your paper?
Yeah, well, I do want to talk about that. I also want to just mention that, to just sort of drop a bomb of economic nerdiness on this. The principle that the chairman of the FTC said should guide market definition is firm-specific labor supply elasticity. That is a parameter that pertains to how likely would employees be to leave given a reduction in wages of a certain amount. And that is a question on which we have a significant amount of new research coming from, I think, some very creative types of economic experiments that all point to that number being very low, meaning that workers are quite locked into their particular job. So I'm thinking of a paper about the Amazon Mechanical Turk environment where the jobs are extremely repetitive and everyone does them. Well, I don't know about everyone, but it's possible to do them from your home. You just need an internet connection. In theory, the search costs are minimal because all the jobs are right there in one menu. And it found that employers have an enormous degree of monopsony power in that context. That I think the parameter in question was like 0.1. That is an extreme amount of monopsony power, to the point that every single employer on the Amazon Mechanical Turk environment would be considered a monopsonist from the perspective of the antitrust laws. Again, this is what the chairman of the FTC said is the guide to policy in terms of defining labor markets for monopsony power. And that, again, is the context in which we would expect to see the least amount of monopsony power, because the switching costs are lowest and it's easiest to switch jobs. So even if you can see in the economy that there are people who would say, to have a different type of retail job and then work in wireless mobile or vice versa, the reality is that many employers do exercise monopsony power over their employees. I know this from my own work on geographic mobility. I used to present my own dissertation that had to do with that subject, and people would say, well, why don't people just move to wherever, if they can't find a job, it's not that hard. And, okay, that's your point of view, but that isn't actually the reality of how people experience the economy. So I'm not, I would say antitrust can really easily run aground on these kind of abstruse questions of market definition, where if you look at empirical data as opposed to sort of people's general feeling like it's not that hard to switch jobs if you're not the one who's actually doing the switching, that really points to, I think, narrow market definitions and pervasive market power.
Thanks. Maurice, did you want to add anything on this particular issue or either of the questions that were raised?
Yeah, if I could, 2 points. I mean, the first point is, I think it's important to understand why we define the relevant market. We only define the relevant market to determine whether or not the firm can exercise market power. So think of it as circumstantial evidence. If you have direct evidence of a homicide, you wouldn't then need to rely on circumstantial evidence. So if we have direct evidence, for example, like in the fast food industry, of firms exercising market power through no poaching agreements, that is indicative. You might say, well, a fast food worker is probably the least skilled worker, has the greatest mobility, but yet if firms can exercise market power there as was recently found in one economic study, and the Washington State AG's office challenged it, then that is sufficient for antitrust purposes. You just need to get at the issue of market power, either through direct or circumstantial evidence. And the second point about leveraging, if you have then a monopoly and they could split the surplus then with, let's say, a union, that's one parameter of competition. But then you have to think then of what are the other implications that having concentrated economic power on innovation, choice, autonomy, and also what about the political risks when you have concentrated economic power? So the fact, I don't really see then splitting the rents, that by itself is determinative. We've made a decision in our country long ago to disperse economic power as well as political power as a way to promote our democracy.
Great. Heidi?
I'll just say one other thing on this question of would workers be better off if they could, under a monopoly where they could, unionized workers could then split the rents with their employer. It's worth, in addition to what Maurice said, it's worth noting that 93% of the private sector is not unionized. And so it's just not relevant for the vast majority. At this point, we're hoping that unions will, we need a different world, right? But at this point, it's just not relevant for the vast majority of private sector workers.
Hi, I'm Kayla with Global Competition Review. I'm curious why the CWA supported the AT&T T-Mobile merger and is now opposing the Sprint T-Mobile merger. Wouldn't those have similar effects on the labor market? If anybody just has thoughts on that, thank you.
We look first and foremost, not exclusively, but first and foremost upon the impact that a merger will have upon the people who work at the company. When the AT&T T-Mobile merger was announced, AT&T said to publicly and to CWA that if the merger was consummated, that the T-Mobile employees who had been trying for over 10 years to get a union would have neutrality in order to determine whether they wanted a union at their workplace. In addition, AT&T at that point said there is offshoring going on, just as there is between Sprint and T-Mobile, and we will bring back 5,000 jobs. CWA thought those were positives. We did say, when the merger was reviewed, that regulators should ensure that the merger would result in increased investment and upgrading, and that it would not have a negative impact on consumers. So with those conditions, we saw positive. In this situation, I really have to go back to when Deutsche Telekom bought into the US market, when they bought a wireless company called VoiceStream. At that point, CWA reached out to our sister union in Germany called Verdi, and we said, what kind of employer is Deutsche Telekom? We were told, we have a really good relationship. Of course, German labor law is very different. The union represents 50% of the seats on the supervisory board, and there's a very positive relationship. We then went to Deutsche Telekom, the president of our union, and we said, if you buy into VoiceStream, will you stay neutral when employees expressed an interest to have a union? And our president of our union was told, yes. The merger went through. VoiceStream employees began to try and organize. And T-Mobile management at that point, and every year since, has violated labor law in order to squelch employees' rights. This we do not see as in the public interest. The FCC looks at employment. We've looked at what the employment effects of this particular merger are, and just the reduction, you saw the maps, in the number of retail jobs will result in the loss of 25,500 retail jobs. Those are community jobs. The person who asked about impact on women and people of color, particularly the prepaid brands, which are located in lower and moderate income communities, hire people from those communities. The authorized dealers tend to be small businesses from those communities. So among those employees, there is an overrepresentation of people of color. And we looked at all of these factors. We have said, as Vanessa said, if this merger, you were to have verifiable commitments by the management that there would be no job reduction for employees and a recognition, a real recognition of neutrality when people want to exercise their legal rights, those would be public interest benefits. But we have not been able to get that agreement either publicly or privately. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for stepping in. That was helpful. Anybody else have anything to add before we move on? Okay. Let's see, somebody who hasn't yet had a question up here.
Hi, Thomas Ayala with National Taxpayers Union. As you may be aware, T-Mobile Sprint said if they were approved, they would invest $40 billion into 5G. I was just wondering if you took a look at that, how that could affect the job market. There's studies that show 5G could add $500 billion to the economy over the next couple decades. So just wondering if that would have a positive impact on the economy. Thanks.
And I don't know if Maurice wants to answer that. So Maurice, the question is from Thomas Ayala from the National Taxpayers Union about T-Mobile's promise to invest in 5G if the merger goes through. Maurice, is that something?
Yes. So I should disclose that I'm with the concurrence group, and we filed comments on behalf of CWA. And as part of our analysis, we looked to see their claims that the merger is necessary for them to invest in 5G. And what we found is that it's not necessarily, the merger is not necessary for that to happen. In fact, CWA has identified numerous statements made by executives from both entities where they outline their commitment to invest in 5G. And there's nothing to suggest that investing in 5G is merger specific. That based on what they're telling their investors, it would seem to suggest that even if this merger were blocked, they would then continue to compete. And that's what we typically rely on in an industry such as this. We rely on competition to force each company then to invest. And that's what our general thesis has been.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't looked at this specific case as Maurice has, but I can say that there's a lot of debate among economists as to whether monopoly power is actually good for the economy because it supposedly provides an incentive to invest, and that's just not factually correct at all. I think this is sort of a yarn that merging parties often fall back on, that if they're allowed to do whatever it is they want to do, then they'll be able to invest, and that will end up benefiting all of us. And in fact, the kind of current debate among economists is why, given how high profits are in the economy, corporate investment is so low. That is the real puzzle to be explained, and I think that certainly is likely to be worsened if concentration and market power gets even more out of hand.
Shocking that some corporate claims around getting a merger, something that they want, are not always entirely reliable. Others, okay, back there, Randy. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Randy Barber. I'm actually working with CWA on the Sprint T-Mobile transaction. In follow-up to the question about 5G, I would point out that Sprint has virtually no resources available to put 5G into rural areas. T-Mobile pretty much has them all. If you look at the projections that they have set forth publicly for the amount of 5G that they would have in 2020 on a standalone basis and the amount they would have in 2024, the increase in 5G coverage as measured by population is a couple of percentage points. So there's virtually no difference.
Thank you. Any other questions? Was there one back here? Okay. Back to Carl.
The non-compete clauses came up as evidence, but maybe it should be focused on a little more. Seems to me that's an egregious practice. I mean, unless you have intellectual property as to how to make the secret sauce or the Big Mac sauce, if all you are doing is pushing the button to put the sauce on, there really is no rationale for that. So is the movement, the unions, this organization supporting some kind of a legislation to make this a per se violation unless the employer demonstrates that there's a reason for it, or what can we do about it?
Thanks. The question is about non-competes and what we can do because it's a flagrant violation. And I think Marshall and then Heidi.
Yeah, so in the Congress that's just coming to an end, a bill was introduced that would have made non-competes not a per se violation of the antitrust law, which I think would be a good idea, but a presumptive violation of the law, which is a slightly less good idea, but still a good one. I am looking forward to potentially, hopefully seeing that proposal get more legs in the coming Congress. I think I would just go back to what the chairman of the FTC said in testimony last week, which I previously quoted. His view is that non-compete clauses are only potentially violations of the Sherman Act if they occur, if they are done by a firm that has market power and if they are used to prolong that market power. And market power is a very specific set of observables, that is to say concentration, as Maurice was talking about, whereas what we know about labor markets is that they're highly monopsonized, that they're small for the purposes of antitrust law, and also that, again, as Maurice was talking about, the imposition of a non-compete clause is itself evidence of market power. It is direct evidence of that. It is better than circumstantial evidence of that. And so one of the ways I hope that we'll see some potential legislative activity in this area is to recognize that the definition of market power needs to be expanded. What we have called the indicia of market power needs to be expanded as part of antitrust enforcement in addition to the structural issues, that is to say horizontal concentration. We also have a look at the direct use and imposition of market power as it really exists in the economy. And I think that non-competes are an obvious place to kind of put that into effect.
And I'll just add one quick thing. We're coming out with a paper early next year on the incidence of non-compete agreements, so stay tuned for that. But it's worth pointing out this joke that I make around this office all the time, that we should just refer to non-compete agreements as monopsony agreements. Like it really is, it's the firm that may not be a single firm in a labor market, but they are making themselves the only option that worker has by saying you actually can't go get a job with another competitor.
Any other questions? I think that pretty much wraps it up, but please join me in thanking this awesome panel, Marshall, Heidi, Vanessa, and Maurice. And stay tuned. This was our second Monopsony event in a week, but I predict more coming in 2019. There's nothing happening next week, so don't come back.